In the last episode about this book, I tried to open the door. A Defense Intelligence Agency analyst named James Lakatsky reads about Skinwalker Ranch, visits the property, has a strange experience, and becomes one of the central figures in the creation of OSAP, the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program. Senator Harry Reid, with the support from Ted Stevens and Daniel Inouye, helps secure funding for this. Robert Bigelow creates BASS to execute the contract. Colm Kelleher helps build the Vegas operation. Investigators, scientists, and field teams start collecting UAP cases at a scale the public wouldn't understand until years later. That was the part that was easy to understand. Now I want to get to the part where the ranch appears to follow people home. I know I have to be extra timid when I talk about this because this is where the material gets pretty weird. The claims in this episode are largely from the book's insider account. Now, I understand this isn't the same kind of evidence as the Pentagon releasing Navy videos, or the ODNI saying some UAP remain unexplained. This is witness testimony, internal investigation, and interpretation by the authors, who in this case happen to be very credible individuals, at least from my perspective. I believe the phenomenon is real. I also believe that the closer we get to the human body and the human home, the more conservative we have to be. That said, the book's claim is otherworldly. Some people who visited Skinwalker Ranch allegedly experienced anomalous activity afterward in their own homes, often far away from Utah. Footsteps, orbs, shadow figures, poltergeist-type events, sometimes even illness. The authors call this the hitchhiker effect. In normal language, you go to the ranch, and something comes back with you. This is where the UFO story stops acting like a UFO story and starts resembling folklore, spirit attachment, radiation exposure, and intelligence operation all kind of standing on top of each other wearing a giant trench coat. Welcome back to Idiot Mystic. The book describes a dinner in Washington, D.C. that becomes one of those strange hinge moments. On paper, it's just a dinner, but in practice, it brings together a remarkable collection of people. Lakatsky, Bigelow, Kelleher, Hal Puthoff, government investigators, and others orbiting the early OSAP world. Some of the people at the table were already investigating the Tic Tac case. Luis Elizondo appears in this world much before he becomes a public figure. Jonathan Axelrod, the pseudonym used in the book for a senior aerospace engineer in naval intelligence, is part of the circle. The point is that by 2009, there's already a network of serious people comparing notes about UFOs behind closed doors. And then, Skinwalker Ranch ends up being part of the program. Several members of this group visit the ranch. The book describes Axelrod and colleagues walking the property, seeing a silvery, craft-like object, and then experiencing phenomena after they get home. At Axelrod's home in Virginia, family members reportedly see orbs, hear footsteps, and encounter dark figures. At one point, the book describes an upright, wolf-like creature seen near the home. Again, this is the book's account. You don't have to turn off your discernment to listen. Keep it on. Keep it very on. But notice the pattern the authors seem to want us to see. The phenomenon at the ranch doesn't behave like a neutral object. It seems to behave like it notices people and follows attention. It crosses from place to place and seems to move through relationships. That's why the word hitchhiker is so disturbing for me. A hitchhiker doesn't belong to the road. They usually attach to the traveler. And if that model is even partly true, then a UAP encounter stops being just a sighting. It ends up looking much more like contact with a system. Now let's leave Utah for a minute and go to Lagol, California. In July 2009, according to the book, a family on a rural property in Ventura County sees strange blue lights in an orchard. The witnesses include a retired law enforcement detective, which is kind of important because training doesn't make someone infallible, but it does make the testimony harder to dismiss in a casual way. They see multiple intense blue lights hovering near the ground. They think someone might be on their property, maybe trying to steal expensive trees. They drive toward the lights and suddenly they vanish. The gates are still locked and there's no obvious entry or exit. Then the weirdness expands. The family reports more unexplained events. Lights, noises, doors, disturbances, the sort of low-level activity that feels ridiculous when written in a list, and horrifying when it happens in your house at night. Bass ends up sending investigators. This is one of the most important differences between this book and ordinary paranormal lore. The story doesn't stop at them being scared. Field investigators show up and interview people. They map the property and they bring equipment with them. And then, according to the book, the equipment starts misbehaving. Batteries drain early, instruments fail, devices that have worked normally elsewhere become unreliable. This is one of the recurring motifs in anomaly research. The instruments you bring to measure the weird thing usually become part of the weird thing. Skeptics will say equipment fails all the time. They are right. Batteries do die. Instruments do glitch. People misremember. That's why one failure means very little. But patterns mean something too. A serious investigation asks whether the failures cluster around specific locations, events, witnesses, or conditions. OSAP was at least trying to build that kind of picture. Now we need to talk about the blue orbs. Chapter 8 of this book is called Blue Orbs Are Not Benign, which is one of the few chapter titles that just made me feel uneasy. The book gives examples of blue orb encounters that allegedly accompany physical effects. One case involves a biotechnologist and his daughter driving in Oregon. They see bright blue objects moving in a nearby field. The objects approach, and the story becomes less like a distant sighting and much more like an encounter. The book then connects certain orb encounters with health consequences. This is where the material becomes extremely sensitive. The authors discuss illness, immune system changes, and medical anomalies in people who had close encounters. They're not saying every illness comes from UFOs, obviously, but they are pointing to a subset of cases where close contact with anomalous phenomena, from their interpretation, appears to correlate with biological effects. That idea isn't as absurd as it sounds at first. If a phenomenon emits radiation, microwaves, directed energy, ionizing exposure, electromagnetic fields, or some unknown environmental stressor, the body can act as evidence. The body records attacks and the immune system responds. Blood and skin change. Neurological symptoms appear. I think the hard part is proving causation. Someone gets sick after an encounter. Did the encounter cause the illness? Did stress trigger something already latent? Was the timeline coincidental? Did the investigation miss an ordinary exposure? These seemingly small questions are the difference between science and panic. The book's contribution is that OSAP seems to have taken the body seriously as a data source. For me, that's huge. For decades, UFO research focused heavily on lights in the sky, witness drawings, landing traces, radar returns, and photographs. All of those are super important, but if close encounters affect people, then we need to start looking at the witness as more than a storyteller. And I think that might be the most important and uncomfortable idea in the whole book. No, chapter 9 takes it further, bringing something home. The infectious agent model. Now when they say infectious, they're not necessarily saying that there's a literal alien virus crawling into your eyeballs. The model is much broader. It asks whether exposure to the phenomenon can spread effects through family systems or households, almost like contagion. That sounds paranormal, but also psychological, biological, and even symbolic. And this is where I want to bring something in from my own world, without mixing categories too casually. In spiritual traditions, people have always had language for contamination after contact with certain places, beings, graves, or charged environments in general. In psychology, we have language for trauma transmission, suggestion, stress responses, and contagion of fear. In medicine, we have immune activation, environmental exposure, toxins, radiation, and autoimmune cascades. And then you have the hitchhiker model sitting at the crossroads of all of that, kind of awkwardly holding a government badge. I definitely don't think that makes it true, but for me, it makes it worth studying without giggling. The authors argue that the phenomenon can affect households. People return from the ranch, and family members who never went there begin having experiences. That single claim, if accurate, is far more revolutionary than a saucer in the sky, because a saucer in the sky still belongs to aerospace. A hitchhiker belongs to ontology. It asks us what kind of reality allows a phenomenon to attach to attention, travel through people, and manifest differently in different environments. This is why Skinwalker Ranch isn't just a location. It's kind of where categories just break down. UAP believer, skeptic, scientist, mystic, folklorist, neurologist. Everybody gets dragged into the same room and has to figure out what is going on. Now, let's be honest about why this is hard for public disclosure. If the government says pilots saw unknown objects in restricted airspace, I think the public can handle that. That is serious, but it fits into national security. Now, if the government says some personnel experienced anomalous phenomena in their homes after visiting a ranch, I think the public reaction changes. Journalists laugh, and scientists back away. Politicians pretend they never opened the email. Suddenly, everyone's busy. So the Skinwalker material threatens the respectability of the UAP topic. And yet, if the authors are right, cutting out the weirdest data gives us a false picture. It would be like studying a fire by refusing to look at the smoke because smoke is embarrassing. I think that's the core of this book. The respectable UFO story may be incomplete, and the complete story might be too strange for respectable institutions to admit. That's a brutal place to be. By the end of this second episode, we've moved from government origin story into the ecology of contact. The dinner brings together people, and the ranch becomes a field site. Lagol shows the program investigating cases far beyond Utah. The blue orbs introduce the possibility of close-range biological effects. The infectious agent model asks whether anomalous exposure can move through households. This is no longer just, are UFOs real? That question, like I've been saying for several years, is far too small. What we should maybe be looking for is the full footprint of the phenomenon. In the next episode, we go back toward the evidence architecture. Harry Reid's SAP letter, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, black triangles, the Tic Tac investigation, the data warehouse, the ranch surveys, and the scientific attempts to measure the unmeasurable. Because OSAP didn't only collect ghost stories. They built databases, wrote reports, studied radar cases, looked at foreign programs, and tried to design technology to catch the phenomenon in the act. The tragedy, or maybe the comedy, is that the phenomenon may have been catching them in the act too. This has been Idiot Mystic. Thank you for being here, especially now that the show is growing. Maybe send this episode to someone who can handle the idea that the Pentagon accidentally funded a study of flying saucers, wolf creatures, immune systems, and haunted ranches. That person might not exist, but send it anyway. Keep your discernment sharp and your wonder alive. And if you ever visit a place called Skinwalker Ranch, maybe don't bring home souvenirs.